All right, here is one we are graphing a secant function. It's problem type 2. And so, first of all, you have to know that your secant function is the inverse of your cosine function. And so, for your normal cosine values, cosine usually starts at 0 and goes up to whatever the amplitude is. Normally your amplitude is 1. Then you have pi over 2 crosses at 0. At pi, you go to -1. At 3 pi over 2, you're at 0. And at 2 pi, you go to 1. In this case, my amplitude, I have the -2 in front. And so this is going to go down 2 instead of up 1. Then I do the opposites here. The first thing we have to do is figure out our shifts. So I'm going to set the part that's inside the parentheses equal to each of these first values here, and then I'm going to solve. So here I'm going to subtract pi from each of these. So 0 minus pi would be at -pi. So -pi, instead of going to 1, is going to go to this amplitude here in front, which is the -2. Going to subtract pi here. If I take pi over 2 and I subtract pi, pi would be 2 pi over 2. Pi over 2 minus 2 pi over 2 would be -pi over 2. That's going to be at the 0. Here, if I subtract pi, pi minus pi is going to be 0. So again, normally it's at -1. -2 times -1 means it's going to go to +2 instead of -2. Here I'm going to subtract pi. Again, pi is 2 pi over 2. So 3 pi over 2 minus 2 pi over 2 is just pi over 2. That's going to go to the 0. And then here I'm going to subtract pi. 2 pi minus 1 pi is pi. And then that's normally at +1, but since my amplitude is -2, 1 times -2 is -2. It looks like if I look at the graph that's on your solution here, however, you can't go to the negative values. You can only go to the positive values. So what you have to do is just continue your pattern here for your next values. So this would be 3 pi over 2, 4 pi over 2, so 5 pi over 2, and then 6 pi over 2 is actually going to be 3 pi. And here, if I continue, this was at 1, so this would be 0, and then this would be -1. So now I'm going to continue. X plus pi is going to equal my 5 pi over 2, and my x plus pi also is going to equal my 3 pi, and so I can just continue my ordered pairs. So here again, I'm going to subtract pi, which is 2 pi over 2. 5 pi over 2 minus 2 pi over 2 is 3 pi over 2. That's normally at 0, so it's going to stay at 0. And then here, if I take 3 pi and I subtract pi, I'm going to be at 2 pi. That's normally at -1. -2 times -1 means it's actually going to end up going to +2. So that when you do your graph, at 0 I went up to 2, which I can see you had marked. Then at pi over 2, so let's make this pi here and 2 pi and 3 pi. So pi over 2 would be halfway in between, would have been at 0 normally, but since I'm doing a secant curve, I'm going to have my asymptote anywhere I have a 0. At pi, there it is. Pi, I'm at -2. I lost where I was. So I have my dot down there. At 3 pi over 2, I'm at 0. So again, I'm going to have an asymptote. At 2 pi, I'm going to go to +2. And so I probably have enough things there. And I hit graph. When you hit graph, it should curve here, curve down here, curve up here. So it looks like you had the pi and the -2 right. It's just that you have an extra dot in there, it looks like. And at 2 pi, you're not quite in the right spot. If I look at your graph here of what you had for your answer, zoom in a little bit. And so you had the point 0.02, you had your asymptote at pi over 2. Not sure what that mark down here on the bottom is. Then at pi, you were at -2. You had your asymptote at 3 pi over 2. At 2 pi, you were a little bit off when you clicked on that. I think you just accidentally clicked one space over. So I should have been right above the pi over 2. And then again, I have my asymptote. Not sure if you hit the graph button or not because the lines are not showing up there. You might have hit the graph button and then you got some crazy graph and went, something's wrong. But that's how we would come up with that solution there. So let me go ahead and see if I can find one more of those. So this time you have y equals the cosecant of x plus pi over 2. There's not a number in front, so we know that 1 is going to be our amplitude, but we do have a shift. So again, we have to realize that the cosecant is the inverse of the sine function. And if I'm doing my points for sine, sine normally starts at 0, 0. And then at pi over 2, you are going to go up to 1. Then at pi, you're going to be back at 0. At 3 pi over 2, you're going to be at -1. And then at 2 pi, you're at 0 again. So those are my normal values. We have a shift here, so I'm going to take each of those values, set this part in parentheses equal to each of my starting values, my x values, and I'm going to solve. So I'm going to have x plus pi over 2 equals 0. X plus pi over 2 equals pi over 2. X plus pi over 2 equals pi. X plus pi over 2 equals 3 pi over 2. And x plus pi over 2 equals 2 pi. So on each of those, when I'm solving, I'm going to subtract my pi over 2. So if I subtract pi over 2, here I am going to get negative pi over 2, and that's going to correspond to the 0. Here, if I subtract pi over 2, I'm going to end up with 0. So the 0 is going to go up to 1. Here, if I subtract pi over 2, again, pi would be 2 pi over 2. 2 pi over 2 minus 1 pi over 2 is pi over 2. Pi over 2 is going to be at 0. That was my third point. Here, I'm going to subtract my pi over 2. 3 pi over 2 minus pi over 2 would give me 2 pi over 2, which is just pi. So pi is going to be at -1. And then here, if I subtract my pi over 2, this would be 4 pi over 2 minus pi over 2, which is going to give me 3 pi over 2. And that should be back at 0. And so, if I am going to do my graph here, and this point may or may not show up on your graph. You may have to do one more point to the right. If so, you would do 5 pi over 2, and that would go up to 1. And so you could just figure out if you go to the next spot. But I'm starting off here at negative pi over 2, 0, if I can happen to plot that point. Otherwise, 0 is up to 1. Then when I have positive pi over 2, I'm going to be at 0 again. Pi, I'm going to be at -1. 3 pi over 2, I'm going to be at 0 again. Right. Since we can't do any negative ones, since we have a negative pi over 2 on this first one, I'm going to add one more to my list. If I have 2 pi, I'm going to add another pi to that, so I'm going to have 5 pi over 2. Since that was at 0, then this one would have went up to 1, 0, 1, 0, -1, 0, 1, and so forth. And so I have to find my next point here. X plus pi over 2 would equal 5 pi over 2. Solving that, I would subtract my pi over 2, which gives me 4 pi over 2, which is then 2 pi. So at 2 pi, I'm going to be up to 1. So now that I have my points, I can go ahead and do my graph. And so at 0, I'm going to be up to 1. At pi over 2 on the sine curve, normally I would be at 0, so that's where I have my asymptote. At pi, I am going to be at -1. At 3 pi over 2, again, I would be at 0, so that's where I'm going to have my asymptote. And then at 2 pi, I'm be back up to positive 1. So when you hit the graph button, you're going to see a curve here, you're going to see a curve down here, and then you're going to see a curve up there. And so my graph is going to look like that.